Today on the podcast, I sit down with Davey Blackburn, president and founder of Nothing is Wasted Ministries. This is a bit of a unique one as this is a two-part conversation. Part one of our conversation is available over on my Grieve Like a Man podcast. Go over to grievelikeaman.com and you can find episode 3 linked up right there. We get a lot more into grief recovery, grief-related parts of our discussion, things a guy like me who's still in the midst of a very fresh grief journey after losing his wife, the kinds of things I would ask a guy like Davey, who's 9 years further down the path than me. So that's part one. So again, grievelikeaman.com, episode 3. And in part 2 here in the Shaun Tabatt Show, we get into more of his writing journey, other parts of recovery, restoration, just the latter half of the journey, things we didn't necessarily talk about in that first part of the interview. So without further ado, here's my chat with Davey Blackburn. Enjoy. It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Davey Blackburn, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Nothing is Wasted, a true story of hope, forgiveness, and finding purpose in pain. Davey, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Shaun, it's great to be here, man. I love the fact that you just talk about whatever you want to talk about. That's amazing. That's what a podcast co-host or a podcast host should do, right?
Yeah,
that's awesome.
As a guy who works in the Christian publishing space, forever I felt like I only was supposed to talk about Christian books, but I would run into business, marketing, other topics that were interesting to me. And so I just started kind of going off the reservation some and talking to people that don't work in my space. So I had to mix up the opening just to, because if I said I was just talking with Christian authors, some of the people were like, I don't fit into that space. So so we try to keep the variety. It's mostly to keep my ADD brain excited and engaged is really, really where it comes from. Some of you may have already heard what we'll call part one of Davey's and my conversation. My newest podcast, Grieve Like a Man, Davey is featured in episode 3, and we talk about more grief and loss and just kind of explore, and we'll get into some similar things here, but explore the kinds of things a guy like me who's just walked out a journey of losing a spouse would ask a guy like Davey who's further down the road. And so that's sort of where we go. So we'll call that part 1. If you haven't listened to that, go to grievelikeaman.com, check out episode 3. That'll be linked right up there for you. In this conversation, we're going to talk a bit more about the book, the writing process, and then we'll just kind of free flow into the questions I didn't get to ask last time we talked. So, David, let's start with, for the person who says, well, darn it, I'm not going to listen to that episode of Grieve Like a Man who doesn't know your story. Give us kind of that elevator pitch version of who you guys were, what you were doing in Indy, and just to kind of set the stage for what happened.
Yeah, back in 2015, I was a pastor and a church planter in Indianapolis. We had moved from South Carolina in 2011 to plant a church. And it was my wife, Amanda, and in 2015, particularly the time that our world got turned upside down, it was our son, Weston, who was 15 months old. And then my wife, Amanda, was 13 weeks pregnant. So we were expecting our second child. We had just gotten to the place where we felt like our dreams were really coming true. The church was taking off. And then November 10th, 2015, I left to go to the gym early. It was a Tuesday morning. It was what I did every Tuesday morning. And this particular Tuesday morning wound up to be a nightmarish and upending event. While I was away at the gym, 3 men were on a random crime spree through our city. They saw me leave for the gym. They had broken into the home 3 doors down from me, saw me leave for the gym, and decided to break into my home too. And my wife was caught up in that. My son, Weston, the 15-month-old, he was in his crib, untouched and unharmed the entire time, but I came home and found my wife with 3 bullet wounds. And she died 24 hours later in the hospital from those gunshot wounds.
And don't feel like we're trying to be flippant and just gloss over this. We go way more at length in our earlier conversation. So would encourage you to check that out before you get into part 2 of the conversation we're having today. If I remember correctly in the book, you talk about, I think this was when you did an early TV appearance to talk about your story and what had happened. and it's either somebody told you needed to write a book, or a writing coach, somebody approached you and said, hey, this needs to end up in a book. I wonder if at that point in your journey, were you even thinking that you should write about this? That was so early on.
It was very early on. Immediately after, of course, overnight, my world's turned upside down and I'm in this major state of shock. It did become a national news story. And so on some level, I was forced in front of national media to talk about this. Really, part of that was and you know how media likes, especially with crime, they like to really focus in on the parts and aspects of the story that I wouldn't want, nor would Amanda want them to focus in on. The last thing, the egregious thing that was done to Amanda, she would have wanted the story to be focused on something different. And, her life, and most importantly, who she lived her life for, and that was Jesus, and the impact she was having in people's lives. And so immediately I'm forced to talk about this in front of national television. I have a congregation that I'm pastoring through this. So while I took some time away to really spend some time, kind of hunkered down away from the national media firestorm, as well as get some very intensive counseling immediately, I did 3 months later go back into preaching. And part of that was a cathartic thing for me. I felt like I needed to take back territory in the spiritual, that was the only way that I could start to flesh out some of the things that I was experiencing, feeling, how I felt like God was meeting me in this. And as I began to do that, I began to realize that people in our congregation, it was almost as if it was the first time that someone gave them permission to talk about pain in an honest and real way in church. Ironically enough, that should be the place that we could bring our pain and we can really flesh these things out. But for whatever reason, in church world, historically, we get really uncomfortable with pain. And so we try to put some pat answers to resolve or to solve people's pain. And we whitewash it and we try to move along with this idea of like victory, Jesus is resurrected. And so as I'm beginning to flesh this out, people are experiencing so much healing emotionally, spiritually. And so I started to write a blog, and that blog began to be read by tens of thousands of people around the country. And it was shortly after that, the beginning of that blog, that I was invited to go and be a part of a living room event with Bob Goff. And so many of your listeners are going to be familiar with Bob, and he's always been very encouraging of writers to begin to just write down their story. And so he told me early on, even before he invited me to this living room event, he had invited me up to an event in Chicago, and he said, Davey, everything you're feeling, everything you're going through, I want you to write down. And he knew as a pastor that I already had some kind of experience in writing. He also knew that this would probably be a very cathartic and healing thing for me. He was training me to form a trauma narrative before I ever even had terminology for that. And so as I began to pull open this Evernote, every single time I felt like God gave me some kind of, epiphany or some kind of paradigm shift of thinking, I would write it down in this Evernote. And so then as I was out later that summer, this was the summer of 2016, I was out at this living room event, being one of the presenters and speakers with Bob. Then this writing coach approached me and she said, hey, I've been reading your blog, you need to write a book. Have you ever thought about that? And I said, well, I'm just trying to figure out my way through this whole thing. I'm not an expert, so what do I have to offer? I'm just feeling my way through, stumbling through the valley of the shadow of death. And she said, well, I'm reading what you're writing, and I think it's really helpful because it's so raw and it's so real, and people need to hear this and experience this. And so she said, I'd love to connect you with, and so she started connecting me in the publishing world. And I sat down to write the first chapter of this book, and she promised that she would give it the first pass look. She was like, I'll just kind of take the first pass before you turn it into publishers. And so I wrote the first chapter, submitted it to her. I said, I don't think I can be this raw and real. And she read it. She said, this is exactly what you need to do. Just write this out as almost a story so that the people who are reading it, eventually they experience and encounter those aha moments as you are encountering them. She said, when you do that, people will start to see themselves in the story. And then you don't come off as the hero of your story, because you're not. I was admitting, like, I'm not the hero of my story. God's the hero of my story. He's leading me through this. And all these other people he's gathering around me to give me advice and counsel, and they're the true heroes of this story. And she said, well, you need to write it like that and show people that they also have other heroes, other guides in their story that will help them through whatever valley they're going through. So that's kind of how it all began to materialize.
That's really intriguing to me, because one of the things God challenged me when we first started our cancer journey with Lynette was just to be very public about it. So I wrote on almost a weekly basis, if not a few times a week, depending on what we are walking through. And it was fascinating to me to have other friends in the Christian writing space talk about how it's really strange for guys to share this level of depth and these kind of tragedies or hard things you're processing and walking through. A close friend of mine told me, she's like, I expect this from my girlfriend, so to speak, but I've never watched a guy do this. It's interesting to me that you and I both had similar experiences where people are like, wow, this is like rarefied air. We usually don't get to kind of breathe this kind of stuff or read this kind of stuff. The other thing interesting that you just said too, in terms of like, people have a tendency to talk to you or me or other guys that we know who've walked this same path. They're like, oh my gosh, you're such a hero. It's so amazing. And all this, you're just the strongest person ever. And while the compliments are nice and, you really appreciate that, maybe you people felt like they can look up to you in some circumstance.
Yeah.
The reality is it's Jesus, it's God in your life. I mean, I always teasingly tell people, if it wasn't for Jesus on this journey with me, I'd be a crazy person. And so,
it's so true. I don't know if that's even in jest. I mean, I think it's, for me, it's absolutely true, because Jesus provides the Holy Spirit, the helper, the comforter, the guide. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And that's through any kind of, right? You think about a valley and a path. Isaiah 30 says, though he give you the bread of adversity, the water of affliction, the teacher will hide himself no more. He will be like a voice whispering, this is the way, walk in it. And so when people come to me and they say, I don't think I could ever go through what you've gone through and respond the way that you have, I ask them, do you have the Holy Spirit inside of you? Because if you have the Holy Spirit inside of you, Scripture says you have everything that you need for life and godliness. And that's not just from when you're on the mountaintop in life. That's when you're going through anything in life. He has equipped you. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead has equipped you to walk through this. Now just tuck yourself behind him in the valley of the shadow of death, and you'll find that goodness and mercy are following you the whole way there. And so I resonate with that. It's like, but I'm not a hero. I'm just stumbling through this. And that's why I wanted to write the book like that, because I wanted people to see, like, this is all of our journeys. Don't look at, I think sometimes when we write, and we look back in the past, and it becomes these pithy theological phrases, almost like the sermonettes that are put down in a book kind of thing. I think sometimes it feels untouchable or inaccessible. And it's almost like, well, man, that's great for them, but I don't know if I could ever really achieve that or do that, or, and I wanted people to go, hey, if God showed up for Davey like that, he can show up for me in my story.
And you, and I don't remember if this was something you got from Levi's book or a conversation you guys have, but you talk about all we have to get through is today.
That's right.
And like, that's something I think when you're walking through this level of trauma, and yet, you're trying to keep it going for your children and your family or your congregate, all the things like, most of the time, guys, we don't have, the ability to just shut down and stop. We have to keep going. Right. Talk to us about what that looked like for you, or, maybe that kind of phrase like gave some structure to what you were already having to do. But that's, it's, you can't look at the week ahead or the month ahead or 6 months down the road. Like, literally, it's just getting through the day.
Yeah, that's what he said in a text message to me. He said, you just got to worry about getting through the day. And I actually have a friend who's a widower too. And this isn't just applied to situations with widowers. I think this is applied to anybody who's going through anything tough on any level, that sometimes you just have to get up and remember to breathe. I remember the entire first year, my New Year's resolution was get up, make your bed. That's it. I had one resolution, and I'm an Enneagram 3 if you like do Enneagram stuff. So I'm a high achiever. Most New Year's resolutions are like, I've got a full list of, all these things that I want to achieve that year. That year, it was get up and make your bed. Every day, just get up and make your bed. Because if I made my bed, the chances were I wasn't going to get back in it. And it also gave me something to put my hand to, almost like military-esque, like, all right, I felt like I had everything feels out of control right now. I feel like I have zero agency in what's going on. I don't know how to navigate this, but I've got agency in this. I can make this one small decision every day to make my bed and to partner with God. It was like a symbol of partnering with God to put some form and some order and some structure to the chaos. And I think that really helped as a mindset thing in a lot of ways. But it is just every day, just try to get through today. Get through today. That's all you got to worry about. Tomorrow, Jesus said it this way, tomorrow's got worries enough for itself.
Yeah, that's for sure. In terms of like, pick something that gives you structure. Like for me, I get up very early in the morning while all my kids are still asleep, and I'll walk 3 or 4 miles, and it gives me quiet time to pray and just think and get ready for my day. And so whatever that thing is for you, finding a repeatable pattern that allows you to start your day and set yourself in motion is invaluable. It doesn't have to be making your bed. It can be anything, but whatever it is that keeps you moving and gets you moving in a momentum, I think that will be very helpful. I want to touch a little bit more on just the writing process, like start to finish. Like, how long did it take you? Because obviously, you're getting feedback and you're working on the manuscript, but like from start to finish, like how many years did it take to complete this project?
Well, so I sat down to write the first chapter. I wrote the book proposal first, right? And you write the first 2 chapters in the book proposal. I did that in August of 2016. So it had not even been a year. But I felt like through Bob Goff's advice, the collection of Evernotes, right, all of these things, it just was spilling over. And God was doing so. And that's really what you're reading in the first 20 chapters of Nothing is Wasted, is it really only covers the first 6 months. So there's a whole lot jammed in there of what happens in those first 6 months of the healing process. And so I began to write it in August. I turned in the first draft of the manuscript in January of 2017. So August to January. And for me, I didn't get a single bit of writer's block in that. In those first 20 chapters, it was like just free flowing. Part of it was, I think, the way that I wrote it. It's just this almost stream of consciousness, like telling the story. So that made it a little bit easier. But then also, I just credit the Holy Spirit. I think he just took over in that. And it became, again, a very cathartic and healing thing for me. Well, then once we turn it, and you do your edits and stuff for the next few months, and we had set in 2017 to release the book. However, the trial hadn't happened yet. And once the defense found out that I had written a book, the first chapter is written in such detail of what happened that day. They considered that admissible evidence, like a testimony. So in 2017, we had to tender the entire manuscript to the court, and it got bound up in the legal process. So from 2017 all the way until September of 2022, so 5 years, it was tied up in the legal process. Well, in the midst of that, the arm of, Simon & Schuster that I'd originally signed with, it folded. And then, so my manuscript gets my publishing deal gets passed around to all these different places. And finally, by the time the trial actually happened, the publisher came back to me and they said, hey, actually, I don't think we're the right publisher for you yet. We want to just release the rights back to you. We're not going to make you, pay any advance back or anything like that. Just release the rights back to you, go shop around. Well, so much had happened in those years, that any publisher we talked to, they said, hey, I think you need to write a couple more chapters to bring the reader up to speed on some of the, the first 20 chapters are like, I believe nothing is wasted. I'm putting my stake in that, and I'm believing in faith, but I didn't feel it, and I hadn't experienced that necessarily. The last 2 chapters is where you begin to see unfold, oh, this is what God is doing when he takes what the enemy means for evil and turns it around for good. Those last 2 chapters, however, took me about 2 years to write, because I just couldn't figure out how to bring all of what had happened into focus and help the reader. And it felt like a lot of pressure, to be honest with you. It was like, how do I summarize all that God has done in 2 chapters? But you hear about, my remarriage and the really interesting, really only providential, right, connection that God wove into me meeting Christy and how she was connected to my story. And then you hear about the closing of our church, me stepping away to do Nothing is Wasted for, full time, and just the grieving of that. You hear about the trial in those last 2 chapters and what it was like to actually be in a room with those 3 men for the first time and look my wife's killer in the eye. And so that's what kind of gets packaged into the last 2 chapters. That took a long time. It felt like it was kind of running through molasses a little bit.
Yeah, you do fit an awful lot into that latter part of the book, but I think it makes the book that much better. I mean, not that the book would have been bad if it had been published several years back, but just to get there's some bookends that needed to be told about your journey and your story that really allows us to agree with you that nothing was wasted, and just the restoration of the things you see in the latter part of your journey. I think that's what somebody like me, who is much earlier in my journey, like, man, God's going to do that in my life too. I feel like there's a hope element that just wouldn't be, like, it would be relatable, but it wouldn't have been like fully baked. So I'm glad it got passed around and delayed just so it could be, and that's the kind of thing you look back and you're like,
Yeah.
Well, that was totally God's providence and his hand
Totally.
that it got delayed and pushed out and all the things just so it could be everything that it needed to be.
I love what John Flavel says. He's a Puritan writer. He says that providence is like the Hebrew language. It can only be read backwards. And that's so true. We look back on it now, we're like, man, if in 2017 this is released, I don't think we would have been ready. I don't think I would have been ready. I don't think this, it would have been an inspiring thing, but I think right now we're actually because of our ministry, we're able to help people with not just inspiration, but transformation. We have the tools and the guides, the coaches to walk people through the valley now.
Yeah, you have so much more to offer people at this point in the journey. One thing that was kind of fascinating to me that you talk about in the book is kind of this idea from when you kind of come off of the adrenaline high and you have to actually start dealing with pain. I can very much relate to that. We're 5 months from when my wife passed, and for most of you who followed the journey, like it's been 2 years, so there's been a lot of crazy in the midst of that. Yeah. But there is that point as life starts to settle, people start to fall away, and they aren't talking to you so much anymore. Where you come off of that adrenaline high, and you really have to start processing that pain. What'd that look like for you? How have you seen that with other guys that you've worked with in your ministry? Like it's weird because you feel like you're doing really great for a few months, and then you're like, right. Oh, wow, there's all this stuff I have to deal with.
Right. Yeah, it's almost surprisingly great. You're like, wow, but you're right. I think that adrenaline or the obligations, the responsibility that we have in life is propelling us forward. And then you get into this space inevitably. And I find it, whether it's 2 months in, 5 months in, whatever it is, it always comes. And that's the space that feels like the valley of the shadow of death. It's the space of despairing where you are dark place and all of those things. I think it's part of God's grace. I think if we had felt all of this in the immediate aftermath, it probably would have quite literally killed us. But God suspends that in his grace, and then he begins to, let that suspension off, and we start to feel the weight of that. And then we have to sort through each one of those things. So triggers begin to arise, or these deep, hard, difficult thoughts. And it's not just the initial loss. Sometimes it's these secondary and tertiary losses that are related to the initial loss. And then sometimes God's doing some, as a skilled surgeon would, while you're on the operating table, he's finding cancer that's something that's totally unrelated. But he's like, well, while we're in here, we got to get this out too. And so, there's this refining thing that begins to happen. And so what I've found in short, and I talk about it exhaustively in the book and show people how I had to come to this place, is as I leaned into those things, as I didn't see my triggers as villains of my story, but I began to see them as invitations from God into deeper healing. Because if you see triggers as a villain of your story, you run away from it, you try to use maladaptive coping mechanisms, you numb, you suppress, you box it up, you don't want to deal with it. But if you lean into it and actually face those head on, then God can do the work that he needs to do in your heart. And then those things don't haunt you. The triggers don't haunt you anymore. People are like, well, how do I get rid of these triggers? Well, the only way you get rid of them is face them. Well, how do I Davey, the images that you had as you went in and you found Amanda, how did you get rid of those? Well, I had to let God minister to me by facing it, by going back into the house, by laying down in the spot that I found her, by worshiping in that moment, by weeping in that moment, by actually letting myself feel those things as excruciating as it was. But that became the pathway that God invites all of us into, the death first, the suffering first, and then into a space of resurrection where he can put the pieces back together in our heart.
One of the things that caught my eye too in the book is you talk about that Thanksgiving came very shortly after all of this happened. Talk to us a little bit, because I think this is, I've just in having conversations, I find holidays very greatly for people who are processing loss, like having to face holidays and family so close after everything happened. Like, what did that look like for you? How'd you deal with that?
Yeah. What's really interesting too is, and I don't know if it's because I'm aware of it more, like when you buy a red Ford and all of a sudden you see red Fords everywhere, I don't know if it's one of those phenomenon, but there's so many people I know that have experienced loss right before the holidays. So then all of a sudden now, or around the holidays, so now the holidays become associated with that. And that becomes it's like a double-edged sword there, where you're trying to navigate these moments and these memories that used to be so exhilarating and fun and nostalgic. And now it's just cloaked with this air of grief now. And Thanksgiving came that for us, November 11th is when she passed away. And then Thanksgiving's right around the corner. And it was actually right before that was my birthday, my 30th birthday. And she threw this big surprise. So now November just is cloaked with those kinds of memories for me. But I'll never forget, we all decided to celebrate as a family. And it just felt like nobody wanted to celebrate for obvious reasons. Like, I mean, nobody wanted to put decorations up. Nobody wanted to, and we was like, well, we kind of want to for the kids to kind of keep but there was this glaringly obvious empty seat in the room, not just metaphorically, but I mean, actually physically. And all of us were on the verge of just tears the entire time. And it was so fresh that we couldn't look back, and have like a gratitude for how God had brought us through. We were looking forward and going, how in the world are we going to face this? How are we going to do this without her? And so, Thanksgiving and then Christmas was right on the coattails of that as well. And it just felt like that first round of holidays, we were doing everything we could to survive through that. And it wasn't until the next round, and everybody grieves differently. So there are some of our family members that still, right? It's like, it's still so excruciating. But for the most part, as time begins to pass, and time does not heal all wounds. Jesus plus time heals all wounds, right? There's so many people who walk continually wounded for years and years and years and years and years. But as you let the Lord minister to you and begin to redeem some of these things and heal some of these spaces, then, 9 years later, I can walk through the holidays. I can walk through November, and I can look back in fondness and in nostalgia and in gratitude. And I can hold this mixture of, do I have some of the pangs of grief still? Yeah, but I can hold it in tension and in the same hand as some of this joy, unspeakable joy and gratitude and thankfulness for how God has shown up. And so, we call that in our course material, Pain to Purpose, we call that we call it the power of holding and it's finding peace in the paradox is what we talk about. That you can hold these two things in tension and begin to realize like, wow, I can have joy and sorrow at the same time. And that's what I would encourage anybody who's going through it right now, that this isn't always going to feel this way. However, it is one of those things that this is normal, what you're feeling.
Oh, that's good. Jesus plus time heals all wounds. It's a good reminder, because I in looking for content and material on my journey, fell into a lot of, I don't know if I'd call them secular podcasts, but just random podcasts, a lot of them hosted by women. And what fascinated me, and again, men and women are different. Men tend to compartmentalize better. But it was interesting. There were so many people who would talk about how like, oh, it's been 10 years since whoever pick a loved one that died. And every time I get to their birthday or Christmas or whatever, I'm just a wreck, and it destroys me. And that was one of the things that grieved me with some of these stories. Like, man, you need like maybe some more counseling, and you need Jesus in your life to get past where you seem to really be stuck. And so that, everybody expects it's just the time, but really that Jesus plus time, don't miss that. That's extremely, just like but both of us talked about earlier, that it's really Jesus walking us through the journey that have gotten us to where we are, why we seem so functional and have to have done so well. Everybody needs that in their grief journey, not just me and Davey. Yeah. In terms of going back into your house, I know you bounced around and you lived different places. You end up doing remodeling and changing things. Like, what did that look like to find a piece about going back, in the sense that a lot of people would never go back?
Right. And I didn't know if I would ever go back, honestly. And it wasn't until, as you read about in the book, Pastor Levi shared with me that phenomenon or that concept of running toward the roar. It was a paradigm shift for me. And so I began to list out those triggers as I began to realize, oh, they're not villains in my story. What are the things that are haunting me? And part of healing is realizing, and part of just following after Jesus is realizing that we're not to be a slave to anything. God does not intend or want anything to haunt us. That we are free, and we are victorious in Him. So if there's something that's haunting, and there's something that's creating these triggers or kind of PTSD responses, then I've got to track that down and figure out, okay, how do I find healing from this? Well, again, the only way is to lean into it, to face it. And what that is ultimately, it's called exposure therapy. It's funny how science is kind of catching up with the way God wired things to work, Every time we learn more about the brain and neuroscience and how trauma affects the brain, we're like, oh, that's how God created things to work. But that's what I did. I just went back into the house, and I planned for all of us to go back and to pack up the house so I could sell it. I wasn't going to live there anymore. I needed to change something. I needed to start a new normal, as difficult as that was going to be. And so I made sure that I was there an hour early before anybody else showed up, so I could kind of have my time. So my dad dropped me off, and I walked through the threshold of the house and just retraced my steps that I made that morning when I found her, and put headphones over my ears, put worship music on, and I just went and laid down in that spot. And I just wept and I wept and I wept and I wept. But over time, it was about 45 minutes of doing that, I encountered God. I mean, he met me in that space. And all of the stuff that was haunting me, the images that were haunting me, began to kind of fracture. It didn't seem so overtaking or overwhelming anymore. It's almost like I had faced that demon and I had wrestled it to the ground. But another thing that happened that was so profound in that moment is I felt like one of the questions I'd been wrestling with was, God, where were you when this happened? Why did you not protect her? Why did you not prevent this from happening? And I felt like he pointed me to the martyrdom of Stephen that you see in Acts chapter 7, where Stephen looks up while he's being stoned to death. He looks up and he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father, which Jesus is always seated at the right hand of the Father after the resurrection. The only time we see him standing is a moment of injustice. And so it's almost like Jesus is going, this isn't right. I'm going to do something about this. Right. So you get almost warrior Jesus right there. It's like, I'm the protector. I'm going to do something about this. And so I felt like God brought me back to that moment, because in our living room, our vaulted ceilings, I could look up, and right outside of Weston's room was almost a half balcony. And I felt like Jesus said, I was right here, standing right here. Now I didn't get a vision or anything like that. I just felt this sense that as I looked up, he said, I was right here outside of Weston's room, protecting him and protecting Amanda in ways that you never could. Because what happened with Stephen's martyrdom is Luke wrote the book of Acts, and he is the most descriptive of any of the synoptic gospels about Jesus' death. Jesus is, the passion of Christ as he's being crucified. Luke is as a physician, he's very descriptive about it. However, he doesn't describe Stephen's martyrdom as something that seems suffering. It says that Stephen looks up into heaven, sees Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father, stares out at everybody and says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And then it says, and he fell asleep. That's what it says. That describes his death. Well, Scripture also tells us, where, O death, is your sting, right? And that to be absent from the body is to be present with Christ. And I truly believe that in that moment, Jesus received Amanda's spirit and protected her soul, her spirit, and her body and her mind in ways that I never could. And so, and then I thought about that, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. So that moment right there, to have that kind of an encounter, that experience with God, really brought a healing salve to my soul. And I know that's one of those moments I didn't write about in the book. I kind of leave that ambiguous. I tell people that as I went back in there, but it was such a profound moment for me because it rewrote some of the narrative for me through a biblical eternal lens rather than an earthly carnal lens.
And for such a deep answer to a hard question, this will seem like a weird left turn, but you mentioned it in the book. How long did you wear your wedding band after Amanda went home to heaven?
1 year.
Everybody's very different, like how long they do that. What was the significance for you to wear it for 1 year, and
I felt
what
a
caused
conviction.
you to take it off?
Yeah, I just felt a conviction. I said, I'm going to just do this for a year, and I'll just reassess when I get to a year, but I'm not even going to turn to the right or to the left. I'm just going to look straight at Jesus, follow him, see what he wants for me, to do what he wants to do in me through all of this. And then on 1 year, our worship team, I was still pastoring the church, and so I took our worship team several months before to this writing retreat, and we actually wrote worship songs that we were out of kind of the grief process, things that God was teaching us. Well, then we recorded that album live at Amanda's home church where her dad pastors, the same church that we got married in 2008. So, and that was the 1 year anniversary of her death. And so for me, I've always approached, I think this is where holidays come in and big significant dates. I think sometimes those tend to take people out when it comes to grief because they're stepping back on their heels and they're so anxious about it. And they're so expecting them to take them out. So it becomes this overwhelming thing. I've always looked at, okay, what can I do proactively to take back territory in the spiritual? how can I go into a different realm and kind of put on a warrior mentality and go, all right, we're going to do something that actually is helping people on these days so that the enemy doesn't have the last word on this day. And that's really helped me a lot. And so that's one of the biggest things we did right there is the 1 year mark. And then after that, I just felt like, okay, God's brought me pretty far along. He hadn't healed me completely. I've had a lot of healing since then even, but at that point I took my wedding ring off. I put it on a necklace. I wore it around my neck until I started getting really serious with Christy. I met her a few months later, and then we began dating. And as I started getting really serious with her, I decided, okay, I'm going to take this necklace off. And that necklace had Amanda's wedding ring on it and my wedding ring on it. You know, it was just one of a symbol. It was like, okay, this is a new chapter. This is a new season.
And in terms of like dreaming again, it's weird to enter into a new season where you're like, okay, wow, God, this is a clean, like brand new canvas we're going to start writing on. I think the way you phrased it in the book was like having to like build or have a greater dream than simply growing old with Amanda. Like what's the timing and what that look like to just dream big things again? Because on the one hand, I feel like when you lose your spouse, you feel like you lost everything. And yet, as we're walking with God in God's timing, he's like, all right, you're not done yet. In fact, right. And I think this is the weirdest thing. You start to see, there's a much bigger, grander narrative that wouldn't be possible without what you've walked through. But I feel like you don't see that till you're far enough down the road.
It's so true, man. Everything you're saying is so profound and so true that, you know, there is something grander that God is calling us into because of the refining work that he does in the middle of the valley. And it's a new season that we would not be built for had we not walked through the valley. But because we walked through the valley and we walked through the valley with the Lord, now he begins to impart and download these new dreams, these new expectations, these new desires in life. And it's not like it was a detour from plan A. It's just that we experience it sometimes as a detour from plan A, you know? And God's like, hey, I'm going to leverage all of what you've experienced in your past, the good and the really hard, difficult seasons. I'm going to leverage all of that for this next season and chapter in your future. For me, it was really interesting, Shaun, because a few years before Amanda passed away, I read The Circle Maker by Mark Batterson. And if that book doesn't get you dreaming, I mean, I don't know what does, right? So I'm like reading this book. We were on a vacation and I said, Amanda, let's go and like write our dreams down. And I'm a high achiever. Like I said, I've got these big old dream lists. I've got this massive exhaustive list on the Evernote. And she writes this one dream down. She said, I want to have a furniture shop. That's what I want to have, right? And if you read the book, you'll know the significance of her refinishing furniture. That's the whole point of Nothing is Wasted. But that was her one dream, and she achieved that dream. She had a furniture shop, and she had a business before she passed away. But, you know, I had all of these crazy big, I mean, just what you call BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals that just seemed like they were not achievable, never would. What's interesting is so many of those dreams, this is really hard for me to reconcile. So many of those dreams came true almost as a direct result of Amanda's death. Now, I share that because when it came to the season of dreaming again, that's why it became so difficult for me to dream again. Because I looked at the dreams that I had, and I mean, we're all a mixed bag of motives. I think you could look at any of our dreams, say, well, there's somewhere this carnal ambition in this, and then some of this is like, man, really altruistic, God honoring, like downloaded from him vision. But like, I look back at that, I'm like, I don't want those if it means going through what I went through and losing everything that I loved like I did. And so it became very difficult for me to kind of move into a new season of dreaming and figuring out what that looked like. And truthfully, my new season of dreaming actually was coupled with a season of surrender, of going, all right, God, if you want me to begin to dream again, then I surrender to you in that. And I'm going to surrender that this may come at a cost too. And I don't know what that cost is. I just know that this life is hard. And my job is to figure out how to live well in a difficult world, not try to make life easy. And so, you know, as I began to surrender that, then God began to bring more vision and new dreams and kind of a new season. But it's almost like I had to bury a lot of that stuff first. It was all the secondary, tertiary dreams that I had to also let die before new ones could be reborn. and before my heart could come to a place where I actually was excited about those. So it's interesting. I don't talk about that in the book, but you really touched on a place where it's like, man, that's a tender place for me, because it's hard. It's very difficult to resurrect or to birth new dreams after you've lost everything.
Yeah, I think you almost have to almost give yourself permission to dream again, because like you feel like, man, should I don't know, should I even pursue things like, or I think the way I would best phrase it, as especially early on in the journey, you're hesitant to think that so many good things could be restored in your life, because you've lived under such a cloud for so long, especially like, and this would be more in my charismatic prophetic culture, but people start praying things over you and speaking crazy restoration things over you. And it's like, I want to believe all this has happened. And I trust that God can do it, but it just feels like a lot when you've spent several years under a dark cloud. It's like, I don't remember what it's like to live like that anymore. Yeah. It's a journey to being willing to accept that. It's interesting to me.
And I think to your point, Shaun, you have to you have to begin to give yourself permission to feel and experience joy again. And that is one of the most difficult things, because you start to feel guilty for feeling joy again. You start to feel guilty for feeling whole again. You start to feel guilty for dreaming something up again that didn't involve the person that you lost, and that's like, that can be a very disorienting experience. And so I remember my aunt gave me that permission. She was like, Amanda would want you to feel joy again. And when she said that, it was like, oh, you're right. You're right. So there's enough grief in all of this. On those moments where I wake up and I have this like, wow, I feel kind of light today. Appreciate that.
And it was interesting to me that you'd mentioned that Amanda got to live out her dream of having a furniture business, a furniture store, which, again, when y'all read the book, you'll find out about it. What was interesting with our journey, my wife had always wanted like some kind of an acreage, rural kind of home situation like she had when she was a kid. And we actually got to have that about a year and a half before she got sick. We happened to move to South Carolina. And so it is interesting how even in, such dire circumstances where like none of us would have wished this on anybody, but to be able to go, yeah, but she got to live out her dream. Like it's just the kindness of God when you, even in the midst of the pain, you do see little gems like that. Like, wow, that is really some providence there that, your wife could get to realize a dream before she gets taken home to heaven.
For sure.
Let's see. I have so many millions of things I could ask. How about, what was it like to walk through? And again, over time, you hear how a story like yours, a journey like I've just gone through, how it touches people. God uses these sorts of things in ways that you don't understand to impact families and marriages. I guess the way I'd maybe phrase it is like, what are some of the unexpected ways people were ministered to by this story that maybe you weren't even expecting?
Wow. Well, I mean, we've heard countless. I'm really grateful, and I'll say that because I know that there are a lot of people, with men and women, who have extremely, like, just sound, strong faith, and they believe all the same things that I believe, and they believe that God is not wasting their pain, but they aren't seeing it tangibly or visibly in front of them on the side of eternity, and maybe they won't. So I realize that my experience is extremely rare, and it is something that we hold with a whole lot of gratitude, because we're seeing thousands of people come to know Christ. We're seeing thousands of people being healed. It is unbelievable the impact that Amanda's story is having. And I think part of it is because of just the purity, the faithfulness, the steadfastness that she lived her life. God is honoring her life. And the ripple effect of her legacy is something that really in the spiritual is way more valuable than a life that is lived long. It's a long life. She's had more impact living 28 years than most, 88-year-olds do. And it's really profound to me. I think that, I didn't think that we would experience so many people with different types of stories find healing. I look back on it now, even the way we started the Nothing is Wasted podcast. And at first we were just talking about grief, and it was very much tailored toward like loss of a loved one. But then we began to collect other stories, because there were other people I was meeting and encountering on the journey that I was like, wow, your story's not lost, but man, you've walked through something really significant. and there's a lot of pain there. Talk to me about how you walked through that pain, because that's different. I'm trying to figure, they would share their story. Oh, another one right here. And as time went on and we collected all these different stories, so many people began coming with very different types of pain. So I think that's one of the ways in general that has surprised me, is that now the ministry of Nothing is Wasted, it speaks to and is applied to all different types of pain paths in life. And so, while I thought maybe that there would be some semblance of ministry with people who had lost a loved one, I never just imagined that there would be ministry with people who had experienced sexual betrayal or abuse or childhood trauma or abortion regret and recovery, or all these different types of pain points now that we minister to through our coaching and through our Pain to Purpose course. So I think that in general has been one of the most surprising things. I could tell you story after story after story after story. And we try to collect those stories. We try to put them on our website. We try to share those stories as much as we possibly can, because we do believe that we overcome through the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And I think it's really important for those stories to be something that are documented and collected and shared.
And we touched on this in part one of our conversation, but I want to bring it up again. I'd love to hear, on the one hand, how were Amanda's journals an encouragement to you? I think you get a sense that you found out a bunch of stuff about her secret life, so to speak, and praying for you that you had no clue of what she was doing behind the scenes for you. And then how did you decide what to include in the book? Because it's beautiful in the audiobook. I think that's your sister-in-law that's reading your wife's journal entry.
Yeah, so, Amber, Amanda's sister. Mm-hmm.
So it feels like Amanda's getting to tell parts of her story and her journey herself. So that's a plug for the audiobook. I feel like that was a great value add, but that just felt like an unexpected grace in your journey. Talk to us a little bit about that.
It really was an unexpected grace. I knew that she was a journaler because I watched her do it every single morning, and I watched how she communed with God, and her life was, it had that aroma. She just oozed she's, when it's, when Moses comes down from the mountain, right? At Mount Sinai, it's like, oh, it's evident that he's been with God because his face is radiating. Amanda lived her life like that. So she spent so much time with Jesus, loved Jesus. I have trunks full of journals dating all the way back to when she was 13, 14 years old. It is remarkable. Now it's funny to see some of the earlier ones where it's like, oh, I have a crush on this boy. And, it's just so cute to see how she's talking to God about these things, but she started creating a practice of that. And what's interesting to me profoundly is I realized, kind of thinking about it, like, man, really the only good that we have to offer to the world, it comes out of our time communing with Jesus, right? She is impacting people specifically directly out of the time that she had with Jesus, because of the journals that are, administered to me, ministered to our family members, and now it's ministering to the world. I can't tell you how many people are reaching out and going, it's just, I'm so inspired by Amanda's walk with the Lord and how she prayed. There were a few things. You mentioned one. There were times that she would pray for me. I look back reading these journals, and she would never talk to me about what she was frustrated with or like what she really wanted God to change about me, but God would always be so vigilant in just as the Holy Spirit does, putting someone else in my path to speak that wisdom into me. And she's just behind the scenes praying for me. It's like the Stormy O. Martian power of a praying wife kind of thing. And that inspires me now that I can't change people's hearts. If I want to see something in my kids or even my wife to change, I just need to take that to the Lord. Say, Holy Spirit, you're going to do a much better job at this than I am. Would you convict? And that was really powerful for me to see that in Amanda. And then it was also powerful just to read her prayers of encouragement, things that she was, man, this is what I love about Davey. Thank you, Lord, for blessing me with him. And this is what I pray for him. And it almost like prophetic prayers, it's almost as if she knew she was going to pass. And even though she didn't, but it's like, these are the prayers I want to lead him into his future. And in terms of how we decided, there were a few, you can tell in the book, as they're very pivotal journal entries that really shaped the way I walked through my healing journey. They provided these paradigm shifts for me. So I knew I wanted to put those in there, but I also knew that I couldn't make that decision in a vacuum. And so I asked, her family members, that were privy to the journals, a couple of our really close friends, and just said, hey, obviously we don't want to share her entire life, but I do want people to get to know Amanda a little bit. I think that's one of the powers of the book is you get to kind of know. I had one of her college friends reach out to me and go, she said, I think you really encompassed and encapsulated Amanda's personality in this book. I think you really brought that to life. And that was meaningful to hear that. But I wanted the reader to get to know Amanda so that they would be inspired by who Amanda was, and they would want to live out their life and they're following, their relationship with Jesus in the same way. So collectively, we kind of said, okay, these are knowing Amanda's heart, knowing these are things that she would want to share or she would share if she was sitting down, for instance, counseling you or over a cup of coffee. These are the ones we decided to leave in the book.
And again, I'm so blessed that you were forced to wait to share the book with the world so we could get more of your story and just the restoration that God has brought about in your journey. I think for a guy like myself who's still early on, I get hope from the remarriage aspect of your journey, certainly. Talk to us a bit about how did you know when you were ready to move forward in that way? How did it maybe look different than you were expecting? Because I feel like when you're on the journey and you're alone and you're like, all right, God, I'm walking this out. And this might be a good place to actually start, because I always have to ask 3 questions in one. You do reach a place where you're content with God. Do you want to get remarried and move forward? Yes, but you being on the journey with Jesus, there's enough where that I guess I'd love to hear that aspect of it first, and then just how did you know it was time to move forward?
Yeah, well, I think contentment is a really, that's kind of we can anchor the answer around that, because before I even met Amanda, I read a book by Elizabeth Elliot. It's called Passion and Purity. And it was like her journal. It was like her journal entries and letters that she and Jim Elliot exchanged. And they were wrestling with, do we get married or do we go our own separate ways on the mission field and just follow after the Lord, being content with being single, right? We can surely accomplish more for the kingdom single because we're not encumbered and by marriage, as Paul says. And so that wrestling when I was 18 years old, that helped me to really form a contentment with the Lord and just settle with, okay, God, if it's just me and you doing ministry for the rest of my life, I'm content with that. Well, then he brings Amanda into my life. It's like, oh my gosh, right? Well, we can accomplish more for the kingdom together than we ever could separately. And what a beautiful thing to have this kind of intimacy and relationship and connection with your best friend while you're doing it. Well, then when Amanda passed, I read Elizabeth Elliot's The Path of Loneliness. And that was a pivotal book for me because it was written after she lost her second husband, in between her second and her third husband. She lost her second husband to cancer. She lost her first husband to murder, essentially on the mission field. Second husband to cancer. She's writing this, really a lot of it's an exchange between her and a friend of hers who had just gotten divorced. So she's just talking about this idea of loneliness. So I say that to set up, the answer that I don't know if I knew if I was ready or when I was ready. Looking back on it, I would advise people, I think you're ready when you're not looking to fill a void of loneliness. Because if you try to use anybody else to fill a void of loneliness, you'll be sorely disappointed. Because the only person that is meant to fill that void is Jesus. I'm sorry, Jerry Maguire. There's no, you don't complete me, right? There's only one that's meant to complete us, and that's Jesus. Now, as we begin to adopt again the sense of responsibility and stewardship of saying, you know what, I can, as Jesus said, as Paul said in Ephesians chapter 5, we're to love our brides as Christ loved the church, giving himself up for her. When I feel like, okay, I think I'm ready to do that I'm not approaching this marriage as something I can get from it, but instead something I can give, that I can sacrifice, that's when I think you're ready in the spiritual. However, when you actually get into it, then you realize, man, I was never ready. But your heart has to be in such a place where you are constantly, apologizing and repenting and going, man, I'm selfish and I've got to get back to, because you're in this season where you're surviving in between, right? Whereas when I was a single dad, you're a single dad, you're surviving, you're calling all the shots yourself. You're just trying to make things work. And then you have to go back into another season of being considerate of somebody else, of being a partner with somebody else. And you're not just this rogue that's going and calling the shots all yourself. And so that is kind of something that was a major adjustment for me. And still, I'm almost 7 years into the second marriage. And we're still trying to learn what partnership looks like for us. We're still having these conversations that, because we didn't like grow up together, and as Amanda and I did, we kind of learned. I mean, I was 22, she was 21, and we're just like making life together. When Christy and I got together, we already had very formed lives, very formed pasts. And so we're trying to figure out how to slam these lives together in a blended family, right? And that becomes really complicated. And it just requires a whole lot of humility, a whole lot of repentance, a whole lot of, I'm sorry, a whole lot of, okay, we're going to, like, let's just figure out how to weave and cleave together. So that heart, the anchor of that is you've got to be content in who you are in the Lord, and then be willing to approach this relationship with what you can give, not what you can get.
That's good. I mean, that's one thing I realized a few months praying into this. And for the people who've not heard the context of my story, about 6 years ago, I had a dream where in the dream, I know Lynette's gone. I know she's in heaven. And I'm talking to my children about, hey, I think this is the one, basically asking my children for their blessing to get remarried. And so that was 6 years ago. And I'm not a huge dreamer or prophetic dreamer. That's pretty normal in my circles. But if I have a significant dream, I'm like, I'll write that down. And that was so weird dream. But it did put me in this interesting position along our 19-month journey with cancer, where I'm always praying for healing, but always praying into my future at the same time, going, all right, if that was a true warning dream of this is how this is going to resolve. So like for me, I've been praying into my future for 2 years. So one thing I would just say, really as a comment, as just, if you have a hope of getting remarried someday, start praying for that as soon as possible, and just pray about that every day for God to give you patience and perspective and all the things. And the other thing I've realized the last couple months, as we've just been recovering after my wife went home to heaven, is you can't have this you have to not be looking for somebody to like rescue you or fix you. If that's where you're at, you are not at all in a place. You're lonely, but you're looking for somebody to fix something in you that only Jesus can fix. And in that sense, like, you don't want to enter into a new relationship with what I would qualify as kind of an illegal expectation of trying to have somebody take on something that's not theirs to take on. I mean, they can't do that for you. You need to get to that place where you are content. And I think you'll know when you get there. Like that, at least I can say, praying into this now for over 2 years, 5 months after my wife went home to heaven, I feel very content. Now, if I had lost Lynette suddenly and I was only 5 months past that, I don't think I'd be in the season of contentedness that I'm at right now. But I think you'll realize when you're there, and I think as you get into that spot, your conversations with God about all the things will probably look very different. I guess I'd love to hear if your prayer life shifted or.
Oh yeah. Well, I think that what shifted in me is, instead of chasing the new season, right, or striving after the new season, it's finding contentment in the season that you're in, and then being surprised by the serendipitous nature of how God brings the new season to you. It's like God's the one he's the author and perfecter of our faith. So he's like, all right, here's when I'm going to close this chapter and open a new one. And I think that is the right place for our heart to be in. And my prayers did shift in tremendous ways. I mean, the thing I was praying for in terms of a wife was, I said, Lord, if you ever want to bring me another wife, would she love you more than she loves me? Because that was the marking characteristic of Amanda that made her so special. I mean, if you boil it all down, she was passionately, madly in love with her first groom, Jesus. And everything she did flowed out of that. And everything she was flowed out of that. And that's why she was so impactful to everybody that she came in contact with. And the second thing, so love Jesus more than she loves me. Secondly, love me, because that'd be awesome, right? I definitely want that. And then love Weston as if he were her own. That she would have this sense of, and maybe even prepare her that she's always wanted to adopt. Like she's always wanted to, God can do that, right? Where this becomes this perfect puzzle piece. And then would she love Amanda too? So would she be so secure in who she is that she doesn't feel like she's living in someone else's shadow, because she shines her own light. She's so secure in who she is in Christ that she's not just going to tolerate this assignment that I have in my life to carry Amanda's story. She's going to champion it beside me. And, you'll read about, if you pick up the book, listen to the audiobook, you'll read about how I met Christy and how she just folds into all of those things In fact, a couple of weeks ago when we did our book launch event, Christy's the one that planned the entire book launch event. And I'm just so amazed at the fact that God would bring me this beautiful wife who's unbelievably talented, extremely intelligent, highly skilled, has her own life, has her own light that she shines for the world. She's not living in somebody else's shadow or trying to fill someone else's shoes, but man, she is championing this ministry and this effort as if it's her own. And I'm like, I can't believe just the grace and dignity that she walks in with that. And so it has changed the way I pray because I see God do the impossible in prayer.
Yeah, I've talked to a number of different couples who are any range of years down the road from getting remarried. And it is, I'm amazed at how God does give us really just, especially if there's a stepchildren situation, a love for kids that aren't yours necessarily. Yeah. And just that probably has amazed me most. Just that, people will talk about how it's like they're my own kids. Like God has just given me such a love for them that they may as well have been mine, kind of a thing. And I think too, that is one of the interesting things, just, when you are a single dad with a child, like it's not just you and what you want. It's also, you're praying for somebody that's going to be the right fit for your children. I think also as you're older and more established in life, especially if you're in a ministry circumstance, like there's also a lot of career related things where somebody needs to fit into that world because it's a complicated world at times. And so I guess if I had to say one thing that I don't know if I'd say I find it surprising, you're really praying and pressing into very different things for this remarriage season than you'd say did the first time around, because it almost feels like the assignment has such an upgrade that there's more at stake. And so you do have to be so much more patient and purposeful. And maybe it's just everything, you feel everything bigger, I guess.
Yeah. There's so much more involved. It's so much more complex.
I think the place I'd love to kind of land as we wrap up, and again, this is something that really stuck out from the latter part of the book. Talk to us a little bit about like losing friends on the other side of the journey. Because on the one hand, there's a lot of people who will come alongside you during the grief journey, and it's intense, and they're with you, and then people kind of start to fade away after the memorial service. There are couples and families and people that were a part of your life because of you and your wife as a couple and kind of as a family. And when your wife's no longer around, they're going to fade away too. And that's not necessarily bad or good. It just is. But and then there's also maybe relationships you need to say goodbye to because it's just a different seat. So I don't know, like how to, because that's a whole nother level of like grief and loss. Because people relate to you very differently, whether it's just you and your kids or if you're walking towards getting remarried. Like the dynamics are so different. People don't know what to do with you.
Yeah. Well, I wish someone had warned me of that. I mean, I think that's one thing. If I wrote like a practical how-to guide on grief, hint, Shaun, that's what I would warn people. Like, hey, there are going to be transitions in relationships and in community on the back end of this. And some of it is because what the fight forged in you together. I describe it almost like, we were a group of people that we were like enlisted in war in a battle. And then when we came back to civilian life, we just didn't know what that looked like. We were kind of confused or disoriented and didn't know how our relationships were supposed to play out after that. And so that's really difficult because when you're forged in the fire, I mean, you get so close with people. And then as you're all kind of transitioning, then it feels like a severing. It feels like a divorce. It feels very, very painful. And I just wish somebody had warned me. And I'm not sure if I would have even heeded the warning if someone had, though. I probably would have thought, oh, no, I'm the exception or our situation's the exception. But that is something that is a sobering reality for all the reasons that you already mentioned. I think sometimes there are people there in our own life, in our own story. I have friends who said, as I went and sought counseling, I had to write a letter saying goodbye to Davey and Amanda. And this person that told me this is still in my life and still interacts with and engages with me and Christy. But she had to actually go write a letter saying goodbye to me and Amanda. Like, this is And that's a really difficult thing for most people to make that transition. And so because they don't know how to proactively make that transition, or maybe they're not even supposed to make that transition with you, right? Maybe in God's sovereignty, this is part of the natural transition of life. God's always shifting things. He's always, we see it all throughout Scripture. We see Paul, who's on these missionary journeys going, I want to be with you over here, but I've got to go do this assignment over here. And so just in the kingdom, we see these transitions and shifts because we're a transient people, right? We're a people that are spreading the gospel. But even in that, I think that a lot of people don't know how to make that transition, or they don't know how to do what I just said in writing a letter to, say goodbye to that past season and step into the new season with you. And so they just kind of fade away. And sometimes that lack of communication can be even more hurtful than a pretty strong, abrupt or definite ending to a relationship. So, some of the things that helped me, I think Henry Cloud has this book called Necessary Endings that was really helpful for me just to kind of get my head wrapped around as I was feeling really hurt by some of those transitions. But that is an inevitable part of loss, I think, is the transitions of community, whether they just are going back to their life because they rallied around you, or whether because they really were meant to transition. And now this new season, those relationships don't serve you and you don't serve them in the new season for everybody. And so God's got something new, and that's part of his sanctification process in your own life and this trust journey that he has you on.
And I think that looks a little bit different for everybody. I think in-laws can be weird to figure that out. Like, What is that? Like, how do you continue to relate with them, even though what connected you or who connected you is gone? I think that's always a strange one to try to navigate. And I think if there are relationships you really want to be intentional, like you're going to have to be extremely intentional just to maintain some level of rhythm. Or people might act like the funniest request I've had so far was from my sister-in-law, who I've known since she was 13. Like, I feel like she's my little sister at this point. But there was this, she said, I don't want to find out when you move towards dating again, don't let me find out on Facebook. Like, can we maintain that level of relationship where, like, you're going to tell me about it and I don't have to get surprised and feel like I'm left out. And so, I think you're going to have to create space for those kinds of relationships, and maybe to have what feels like awkward conversations. But, when you've got nieces and nephews and cousins and everything involved, like, your lives are still going to be intertwined. But I would just say to have grace for people, because they might ask you for weird things that has absolutely nothing to do with you, but it's a way you can bless them and help them grieve and deal with the changes of, because as you're moving on, they're still stuck in a different phase of grief probably. And what it looks like for them to rebuild and move forward, it's just different than you. And that's okay. So just I would say my encouragement, give people permission to do that and entertain the weird questions if you need to, and whatever that looks like. Reader's journey with the book. I feel like with a book like this that has so many heavy and emotional beats, people will fixate on this part of the story or that part of the story. I guess I'm thinking, especially women who read the book. I think for guys like me who've gone through losing a spouse, I totally identified with your journey. Like, big picture, everybody, you're like, okay, this is the thing I hope all of you see in this story. Like, what's that takeaway you hope everybody finds in these pages? Well,
I think everybody is going to relate on the level of pain, right? And like, how do you navigate this? Because that is part of the human experience. In this world, you will have sorrow, you will have trouble, is what Jesus said, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And that's what I want everybody to realize, is that whatever you're going through, God is faithful in that. And so my story may look different than your story, but God's story is really the thread that ties us all together. And his story is one of redemption. His is one of restoration. He's one that walks us through all of these things. And so, and then, the other feedback that I've heard from the book is people were like, this is not just a grief book, it's a book for everybody, because this is a book on how to follow Jesus, right? This is a book on like when there's transitions, when there's right turns, when there are these things that you were not expecting, how do you follow Jesus in that? Which, by the way, is all of us. If you have not experienced that, then you were born yesterday. And so for all of us, how do we actually begin to hear the voice of God, follow after Jesus in the midst of some of these major transitions that we experience in our life? And then how do we really lean into the redemptive story that he's writing in all of us? And that's what I'm hoping people take away from this.
And Davey, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more, coaching, the book, all the things, where do we discover you on the web?
Yeah, well, for me, you can, I'm on Instagram, Davey Blackburn, DAVEY BLACKBURN. Same thing, DaveyBlackburn.com if you want to connect with me there. The thing I would point everybody to, though, is nothingiswasted.com. That's where all of our resources are. That's where our Pain to Purpose course is, all the content. We've got a membership called Community Plus, where there's all kinds of master classes and mini courses and different things by experts in certain types of pain fields. We've got coaching. We've got 36 coaches that can, these coaches they're trauma certified. They're certified through our Pain to Purpose material. They can walk with you one-on-one, and we match people up by pain journey. So, if you've experienced sexual betrayal, then we'll match you up with our sexual betrayal coach who has gone through the same thing. They're just several steps ahead of you, and they can reach back and really help you to see the pitfalls that you're going to experience. They're like a Sherpa helping you climb Mount Everest. And so nothingiswasted.com is really where you're going to find all of the transformative material and curriculum and resources there. Pain to Purpose is our seminal course. We launch it in churches all over the country now, almost like the Financial Peace University of Pain and Trauma. That's what we like to think of it as. But the, small groups and classes all over, churches all over the country. It's been an incredible thing to see how God's been using this story and this material to transform people's lives. So grateful for it. And that's where you can connect with us.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description of the show notes to websites mentioned throughout our conversation, as well as links to where you can pick up your very own copy of Davey's brand new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Davey Blackburn. Once again, our book today was Nothing is Wasted, a true story of hope, forgiveness, and finding purpose in pain. And Davey, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Shaun. Appreciate it, man.